The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the towering pines, its mournful cry weaving through the dense forest like the whispers of unseen ghosts. Snowflakes drifted from the sky, their descent slow and deliberate, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to disturb the solemn hush that blanketed the wilderness. Keanu Reeves trudged through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching over the frozen earth with each step. His breath unfurled and soft, misty plumes before vanishing into the frigid air. He had rented a secluded cabin deep in the heart of this wintry solitude, seeking respite from the relentless demands of Hollywood, the ceaseless hum of city life. Here, the only sound was the wind's breathy lament and the occasional snap of a branch beneath the weight of snow. He welcomed the isolation, the peace that came with being untethered from schedules, cameras, and scripts. But as he wandered deeper into the forest, something disrupted the silence, a sound that did not belong to the wind or the trees. A faint whimper. He froze, his pulse quickening. It was almost imperceptible, swallowed by the wind, yet unmistakable in its distress. His dark eyes scanned the landscape, searching for the source. The sound came again, a strained, choked cry. It was close. Moving carefully, he pressed forward, the snow grasping at his legs. Then, through the network of bare branches and isolated shrubs, he saw it. A she-wolf. She lay partially obscured by a mound of snow, her sleek silver-gray fur stark against the white drifts. One of her hind legs was twisted unnaturally, ensnared in a cruel steel snare. The trap's jagged teeth bit deep into her flesh, staining the snow beneath her a sickly crimson. Her breathing was ragged, her ribs rising and falling in erratic shudders. But it was her eyes that held him captive, wild, frightened, burning with a defiant ferocity even in the face of agony. Keanu's gut clenched. The sight was brutal, almost unbearable. The trap was old and rusted, likely left behind by a careless or indifferent poacher, long forgotten but still carrying out its cruel purpose. The she-wolf had struggled against it. The snow around her churned up in frantic desperation, but the harder she fought, the deeper the metal fangs sank into her flesh. His heart pounded. She was pregnant. Her belly, though lean from the harsh winter, was unmistakably swollen with life. The realization struck him with a visceral force. She was not just fighting for herself, but for the unborn lives within her. A protective mother caught in an unrelenting grip of suffering. Keanu swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a step forward. The she-wolf tensed, a low, guttural growl rumbling from her throat despite her weakness. Her ears flattened, and her lips curled back, revealing ivory fangs, gleaming even in the dim, gray light of the overcast sky. She was terrified, on the brink of exhaustion, yet unwilling to surrender. Keanu raised his hands slowly, his voice a murmur against the wind. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." She did not understand his words, but his tone carried something primal, something beyond language. He crouched, moving deliberately, trying not to startle her further. Her eyes remained locked onto him, burning embers of suspicion and pain. Up close, the wound was worse than he feared. Blood had frozen around the edges of the torn flesh, forming dark crusts of ice where the metal had dug in. If she remained here much longer, infection would set in, or worse, the bitter cold would sap the last of her strength. Time was against them both. Keanu exhaled, steadying himself. He needed to free her. But how? If he made the wrong move, she could lash out. Even in her weakened state, those fangs could do serious damage. Yet if he hesitated too long, she might not survive the night. He assessed his surroundings. A fallen branch, sturdy but light, protruded from a nearby snowbank. It could be used to pry the trap open. He reached for it, his movements deliberate, never taking his eyes off her. The she-wolf growled again, a final warning, but he saw it in her eyes. She was losing the will to fight. The pain was eroding her strength. He positioned the branch beneath the trap's rusted hinge, his fingers numbing against the icy bark. Every movement had to be precise. With a controlled breath, he applied pressure. The trap groaned in protest, the metal resisting. The she-wolf tensed, her muscles coiling as if preparing for another desperate struggle. Keanu pushed harder. The mechanism gave a fraction of an inch. The snare's teeth slackened ever so slightly, and the she-wolf flinched, her claws digging into the snow as pain jolted through her body. Almost there, Keanu murmured, gritting his teeth. With a final, forceful effort, the rusted steel creaked open. The fangs of the snare released their cruel grip, and the she-wolf yanked her leg free with a sharp, agonized yelp. She collapsed, panting heavily, her limbs trembling from pain and exhaustion. Blood seeped from the puncture wounds, dark against the pristine snow. Keanu didn't move. He knew better than to assume she would trust him now. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man and beast, predator and savior. Then, something shifted in her gaze. The fear remained, but there was something else now. A flicker of recognition, a primal understanding. She did not bolt. She did not attack. She simply lay there, her sides heaving, her breath curling into the cold air. Keanu exhaled, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. He had brought a protein bar, planning to snack on it during his walk. Carefully, he unwrapped it, breaking off a small piece and extending it toward her. The scent caught her attention. Hunger battled with her distrust. Her amber eyes flickered between him and the food, weighing the risk. Then, tentatively, she stretched her neck forward, her black nose twitching. And she took it. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest, a strange, unspoken connection threading itself between them. She chewed slowly, her gaze never leaving his. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ground in cold, quiet indifference. But in this moment, amid the vast, frozen wilderness, something had changed. Keanu knew he couldn't leave her here. Not like this. Not now. As the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of an unforgiving night, he made his decision. He would not abandon her. The cold bit into Keanu's skin as he knelt beside the injured she-wolf, his breath a cloud of white in the frozen air. The trap lay twisted in the snow, its rusted metal stained dark with her blood. She had pulled free, but the damage was done. Deep gashes marred her leg, and exhaustion had taken its toll. She wasn't moving. Only her labored breathing and the wary flicker in her golden eyes told him that she was still fighting to survive. Keanu's instincts screamed at him to back away. This was a wild animal, unpredictable and dangerous, and any wrong move could provoke her into attacking. But another voice, one stronger, more relentless, told him he couldn't walk away. Not when she was bleeding, suffering, and too weak to protect herself. The wind howled through the trees, a cruel reminder that night was falling fast. If he left her here, the cold would finish what the trap had started. If she didn't bleed out, she would freeze, or worse, some other predator would find her in this helpless state. Keanu clenched his jaw. He had made his decision the moment he freed her. The she-wolf shuddered as he moved closer, her ears flicking back. Even now, half-conscious and broken, she had the spirit of a fighter. He admired that. Slowly, carefully, he shrugged off his thick coat and draped it over her trembling body. She tensed, a strangled growl vibrating through her chest, but she didn't have the strength to resist. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but she didn't lunge at him either. That was enough. Moving quickly now, before she could change her mind, Keanu slid his arms beneath her fragile body. She was heavier than she looked, all muscle beneath that thick fur, but limp with exhaustion. Her head lolled against his chest, her breath warm against his skin, but the moment he lifted her, a sharp whimper escaped her throat. The sound twisted something deep in his gut. "I know," he whispered, tightening his grip. "Just hold on." The trek back to the cabin was brutal. The snow was deep, the icy wind relentless, and the she-wolf grew heavier with every step. His muscles burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When the cabin finally came into view, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow, Relief crashed over him. His boots hit the wooden porch with a dull thud, and he kicked the door open with his knee. Warmth. The fire was still burning in the hearth, crackling softly, chasing away the bite of winter. Keanu wasted no time. He carried the she-wolf inside, laying her gently on a thick blanket near the fire. She stirred, groaning softly, but her eyes barely opened. He needed to stop the bleeding. Keanu moved fast, his hand steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. He grabbed a first aid kit from his duffel bag. He had brought it for himself, but now it had a far more urgent purpose. The gashes on her leg were deep, the flesh torn where the metal had bitten into her. He soaked a rag in warm water and pressed it gently to the wound. The reaction was immediate. A vicious snarl ripped from her throat, her teeth flashing as she jerked her head toward him. Keanu barely had time to pull back before those fangs could sink into his arm. All right, he muttered, keeping his hands up. I get it, but this needs to be done. She panted heavily, her muscles trembling, but she didn't try to bite him again. She was too weak. Her body sagged against the blanket, her energy draining fast. Keanu worked quickly. He cleaned the wound, wincing as more blood seeped from the torn flesh. The she-wolf let out a sharp whine, her ears flattening in pain. Almost done, he promised, though he wasn't sure if it was for her sake or his own. Wrapping the wound was the hardest part. Every time he touched her leg, she flinched, her breathing sharp and erratic. Keanu murmured to her the whole time. Nonsense words, soft reassurances, anything to keep her from lashing out. Finally, he was finished. She lay still, her sides rising and falling in uneven breaths, her golden eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Keanu sat back, exhaling heavily. His hands were shaking. He hadn't realized how much tension had built in his body until now. He leaned against the couch, watching her carefully. This was madness. He had a wild animal in his cabin, a predator. She could turn on him the moment she regained her strength. She could see him as nothing more than a foolish human who had interfered where he shouldn't have. And yet, Keanu studied her, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her ears twitched slightly at the sound of the crackling fire. She wasn't just a predator. She was a survivor. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the storm raging outside. Keanu dozed in and out of sleep, his body sore from the strain of carrying her through the snow. When he woke, the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. And the she-wolf was watching him. Her golden eyes glowed in the dim light, unblinking, filled with something he couldn't quite define. Not fear, not aggression, curiosity. Keanu held her gaze, unmoving. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached for a piece of dried meat from his backpack. He broke off a small bit and held it out to her, his movements deliberate. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with painstaking slowness, she stretched her neck forward, her nose twitching. And she took it. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She chewed carefully, her eyes never leaving his. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. Days passed. The storm raged on. But inside the cabin, a fragile truce was forming. The she-wolf, Selena, as he had decided to call her, was recovering. She still flinched when he came too close, still bared her teeth if he startled her, but she no longer growled when he entered the room. She ate from his hand now. She let him change her bandages without snapping at him. And sometimes, just for a moment, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would watch him with something that almost resembled gratitude. Keanu knew better than to think she was tame. She was wild, and she always would be. But as the days stretched on, as the ice outside thickened and the world beyond the cabin remained frozen and unforgiving, he couldn't shake the feeling that, for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. And for the first time in a long time, so was he. The storm raged outside, an unrelenting force battering the cabin with howling winds and thick curtains of snow, sealing the world in a blinding white void. Inside, the fire flickered, its golden glow casting restless shadows across the wooden walls, but even its warmth could not erase the tension thickening the air. Keanu sat on the floor near the hearth, his eyes locked onto Selena as she lay curled on the thick blanket he had given her weeks ago, the very one that had been her sanctuary as she healed under his care. But now, her body was rigid, her breaths coming in short, sharp pants, her golden eyes wide with a pain deeper than any wound he had treated. She shifted, muscles coiling beneath her thick coat, and a low, strained whimper escaped her throat, unlike anything he had heard before. It was raw, primal, the sound of something beyond suffering. It was the sound of nature itself, the ancient rhythm of life and struggle, playing out in the fragile safety of his cabin. Then he understood. The pups were coming. A cold wave of panic surged through him. He had known this moment would arrive, had watched the subtle signs over the past few days. Her restless pacing, her refusal to eat, the way she would dig at the blankets in erratic bursts of frantic energy before collapsing in exhaustion. But knowing was one thing, and witnessing it was another. He had no idea what to do. He was not a veterinarian, not a wildlife expert, just a man who had stumbled upon an injured creature and refused to let her die. And yet, despite every logical instinct screaming at him that he had no place here, that he should back away and let nature take its course, he could not bring himself to move. Selena was strong. She had survived the steel trap, had endured pain that would have broken weaker creatures, and yet now, she trembled beneath the weight of something greater than mere survival. Keanu watched, motionless, as she curled inward, her body straining, every muscle in her lithe frame contracting as she fought through the pain. Her breath hitched, her ears flattened, and then, with one final, powerful push, a tiny, slick bundle slipped onto the blanket. He held his breath, afraid to move, afraid even to blink, as Selena immediately turned, her tongue sweeping over the fragile form with desperate urgency. For an agonizing moment, there was silence. Then a sharp, high-pitched cry, barely more than a whisper against the storm's fury, but loud enough to shatter the unbearable tension that had gripped the cabin. The first pup. Keanu exhaled, but his relief was short-lived. Selena was already straining again, her body quivering as the second pup emerged, then the third. He watched, mesmerized and helpless, as nature unfolded before him, as she worked tirelessly, instinct driving her through exhaustion. 4, 5. Each time, the same process, licking, nudging, drawing them close to her warm belly, her golden eyes flickering between exhaustion and fierce determination. Despite the agony, despite the strain, she did not stop. Then, something changed. Keanu frowned, leaning forward slightly. A sixth pup had been born, but something was wrong. It lay there, unmoving, untouched by the frantic life that had pulsed through its siblings. Selena nudged it, licked it with more urgency, but the tiny form remained still. Too still. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. His body moved before his mind could catch up, instinct propelling him forward. He reached out, his hands closing around the fragile, damp body, his fingers barely feeling its weight. Selena growled, a sharp, instinctive warning, but this time he did not back away. The pup was cold. Its tiny limbs hung limp, its mouth slightly open, its chest unmoving. No, not like this. Keanu's jaw clenched, and without hesitation, he brought the pup closer to his chest, cupping it between his palms. It was so small, so impossibly fragile, a thing barely formed, barely real. He pressed his thumb against its tiny rib cage, rubbing in slow, rhythmic motions, trying to coax life in his stubborn, unresponsive lungs. His breath came fast, uneven, misting over the tiny muzzle as he whispered, barely aware of the words escaping him. Come on, you're not done yet. Nothing. The fire crackled, the storm roared, but inside the cabin, Keanu's world had narrowed to the silent, lifeless creature in his hands. He pressed on, his fingers moving with gentle, desperate precision, his breath warm against the pup's fragile frame. The silence stretched unbearably, pressing down on him like the weight of the storm outside, a suffocating reminder of how easily life could slip away. Then, a twitch, a barely there tremor, so faint he almost didn't believe it. Another, a weak, gasping breath. Keanu stilled, his pulse pounding in his ears. The pup shuddered, its tiny chest rising in a broken, ragged motion, then again and again, until finally a soft, wavering cry broke free, fragile but alive. He exhaled shakily, his hands still trembling as he lowered the pup back to Selena. She watched him, her golden eyes unreadable, but the moment the pup touched the warmth of her body, she pulled it close, licking it with quiet, urgent strokes. Keanu sat back, his entire body heavy with exhaustion. His gaze lingered on the tiny creature, the last to be born, the one that had almost slipped away. Lila. The name came unbidden, forming in his mind before he could stop it. A survivor, a fighter, like her mother. The fire burned low, its glow casting soft halos of light over the fragile family, now curled together in a tangle of fur and warmth. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, winds shrieking through the trees, but inside, against all odds, life had taken root. Keanu leaned against the couch, his breath finally steadying. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The heavy snow had begun to retreat, revealing patches of damp earth beneath the melting frost. Winter was losing its grip on the land, and the air smelled of damp wood and thawing ice. The endless white that had once buried the forest was now streaked with the promise of spring. With each passing day, the world grew louder. The distant sound of dripping water, the occasional snap of branches shedding their frozen weight, the stirring of life waking from its slumber. Inside the cabin, Keanu sat on the wooden floor, his back pressed against the couch, staring at the small family curled near the dying fire. The flames cast flickering shadows over Selena's sleek fur as she rested, her body curled protectively around her pups. They had grown so much in the past few weeks, their tiny limbs no longer frail and trembling, but sturdy and filled with restless energy. They wrestled with one another, their sharp little teeth nipping at each other's ears and tails, their high-pitched yelps filling the space that had once been silent and still. Even Lila, the weakest of them all, was growing into a determined little fighter, always the first to pounce, always the last to give in. Keanu should have been happy. But beneath the warmth of the fire, beneath the quiet comfort of their presence, an unbearable weight pressed against his chest. His time here was running out. The thought had haunted him for days, creeping in at the edges of his mind, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. His vacation was nearly over. The world beyond this cabin, the life he had tried so hard to escape, was calling him back. Soon, he would have to leave. The city, the career, the responsibilities that had once defined him. They were waiting, impatient, inevitable. But how could he walk away from them? Selena was strong, but she was still healing. The deep wound on her leg had mended, but it had left behind more than just scars. She was not yet the hunter she had once been, and the pups, helpless, curious, utterly dependent, were not ready to survive without her. If he left them now, abandoned them to the wilderness before they were strong enough, he might as well have left them in the trap he had freed Selena from weeks ago. That was not an option. He had to find a way. The solution came to him one evening as he stood outside, the cool air biting at his skin. His eyes drifted toward the old shed at the edge of the clearing, half buried in the remnants of winter. It was small, its wooden walls weathered and leaning slightly with age, but it was sturdy. It could be a home. Keanu didn't hesitate. The next morning, he set to work, his movements driven by a quiet urgency. He cleared out the inside, sweeping away years of dust and decay. The wooden floor was solid, the roof intact, more than enough to keep out the rain and cold. He reinforced the walls, patched up the gaps where the wind still crept in, and lined the floor with thick blankets from a cabin. He found an old dog bed in the storage closet, left behind by a previous tenant, and placed it in the corner. It was large enough for Selena, a space where she could rest without the pups constantly climbing over her. He built a small feeding station, simple but functional, stacking bags of dried food in a safe spot, high enough that the pups couldn't tear into them. He gathered medical supplies, ointments, bandages, anything that might help if Selena ever needed treatment again. By the time he was done, the shed no longer felt abandoned. It felt safe. That night, he sat beside the hearth, watching Selena as she dozed, her ears twitching at the sounds of her pups stirring. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Lila's tiny body as she stretched in her sleep. "I'm not leaving you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The next morning, he began moving them. Selena was wary at first, watching him with sharp, golden eyes as he carefully lifted each pup and carried them to their new shelter. She growled once, a low warning in her throat, but she didn't attack. She didn't stop him. Lila was the last. Keanu cradled her gently, feeling her small body tremble as she let out a sleepy whimper. As he stepped inside the shed and set her down among her siblings, Selena finally followed, slipping inside without hesitation. She sniffed at the blankets, at the walls, at the food he had left for her. Then, with a deep exhale, she curled up around her pups, pulling them close. She accepted it. Keanu let out a slow breath, kneeling beside her one last time. "You're safe here," he said softly, though he knew she didn't understand. But maybe, just maybe, she did. The drive back to the city was suffocating. The open, endless sky of the wilderness was replaced by towering buildings, by the ceaseless hum of traffic, by the neon glow of artificial lights. The air smelled different, thicker, polluted, wrong. Everything was louder, faster, pressing in on him in ways he hadn't noticed before. But he didn't let himself get lost in it, because he had made a promise. Every weekend, he returned. The first time, he had feared the worst. He had driven through the winding roads, his hands gripping the wheel too tightly, dreading the possibility that he would find the shed empty, abandoned. But when he stepped into the clearing, they were still there. Selena sat at the entrance of the shelter, her body tense as he approached, her golden eyes narrowing with wary recognition. But she didn't run. Lila was the first to greet him, stumbling toward him on wobbly legs, yipping softly as she nipped at his boots. The others followed, more hesitant but curious. Keanu knelt, letting them come to him. He unpacked the supplies, fresh meat, medicine, anything that might help them grow stronger. Selena didn't move closer, didn't let herself bridge the gap between them, but she watched. She always watched. Weeks passed. The pups grew bolder, stronger. Their legs steadied, their bodies filled out with muscle and thick coats of fur. Selena's limp faded, her movements becoming more fluid, more confident. The wild was waking in them. But for now, they were here, and Keanu would keep coming back. The road to the cabin was familiar now, carved into his muscle memory after months of returning, a quiet promise he had kept without hesitation. The drive, once a retreat from a world that suffocated him, had become something else entirely, something necessary. Every weekend, without fail, Keanu packed his truck with supplies, making the long journey back to the wolves he could not abandon. Each time, he arrived with the same quiet anticipation, wondering how much they had grown, how much stronger they had become. But this time, as he turned down the final stretch of road, an unease settled in his chest, pressing against his ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. The air was different. The forest, though still thick with towering pines and the distant echo of rustling leaves, felt emptier somehow. The moment he stepped out of the truck, he noticed the unnatural stillness. No playful yips in the distance, no soft rustling of tiny paws against the forest floor. Just silence. His boots crunched against the frost-laced earth as he made his way toward the shed. The door stood ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze, and a deep sense of unease coiled in his stomach. He quickened his pace, heart hammering harder with every step. The shed was empty. Keanu stopped in the doorway, his breath slowing, his body suddenly heavy with the absence pressing against him. The blankets he had carefully arranged were still there, slightly rumpled, the faint imprint of tiny bodies now long gone. The feeding station was untouched, the last portion of food exactly where he had left it the week before. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no chaos, just emptiness, an echo of a presence that had once been here, but now was not. His chest tightened. Had something happened? Had they been taken by a predator in the night? Had Selena miscalculated their strength, pushing them into the wild too soon? Or worse, had he miscalculated? Had he waited too long, keeping them in a place they weren't meant to stay, making them weaker instead of stronger? The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. He stepped inside, scanning the space for any sign of what had happened, any hint of where they had gone. The shed smelled of them still, faint but lingering, the earthy scent of fur, the warmth of bodies once curled together. He crouched low, running a hand over the blankets, as if he might still feel their warmth there. But it was cold. They had been gone for a while. Then he saw it, a tuft of fur, small, silver gray, caught in the rough grain of the wooden floor near the doorway. He reached for it instinctively, his fingers closing around the soft strands, his breath catching in his throat. It was deliberate. Selena had left it behind. His pulse slowed, the storm of worry inside him quieting just enough for something else to settle in its place. Understanding. She had made her choice. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, grounding himself in the truth that had been there all along. This had always been temporary. Selena was never meant to stay here, never meant to live her life confined within the walls of a shed, no matter how safe he had made it. She had survived the trap, endured the pain, brought her pups into the world despite every obstacle stacked against her. She had allowed him into her world, accepted his help, trusted him in ways that no wild creature should have. But she was never his to keep, and now she was free. He rose to his feet, stepping out of the shed, the tuft of fur still held gently between his fingers. His eyes drifted toward the tree line, searching the endless stretch of forest beyond the clearing. Somewhere out there, she was moving with her pups, guiding them through the wilderness that was rightfully theirs. She was teaching them to hunt, to run, to survive. And they would. He knew they would. The ache in his chest didn't disappear, but it softened, shifting into something else, pride, maybe, or peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had given them a chance, and they had taken it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the earth as Keanu turned back toward the cabin, the forest behind him whispering with life, even if he could no longer see it. For the first time, he walked away without looking back. The road felt different this time. The trees, though still towering and ancient, seemed somehow unfamiliar, their branches twisting in ways he didn't remember. The cabin, once a refuge carved into the frozen wilderness, now stood in quiet solitude, waiting for him. The wooden walls bore the same weathered cracks. The porch still creaked under his weight, and yet something had changed. Maybe it was him. It had been years since Keanu had last driven this path, years since he had stood in this clearing and watched the world swallow up the small family he had cared for. The memory of them had never left him, lingering in the quiet spaces of his mind. Selena's wary, golden eyes, the clumsy steps of the pups, the fragile weight of Lila in his hands as he willed her into life. He had told himself that he wouldn't return, that their chapter had closed the day he found the shed empty. But here he was, drawn back to this place by something he couldn't name. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The snow was light this season, patches of frozen ground peeking through where thick layers of white had once stretched unbroken. The forest felt alive in a way he hadn't expected, the distant rustling of unseen creatures, the occasional snap of a twig beneath something heavier than the wind. Keanu set his bag down inside the cabin, letting the silence settle around him. The fire took quickly, crackling softly in the hearth, its warmth filling the space that had been untouched for too long. He moved through the familiar rooms, running his fingers over the rough wooden surfaces, the ghosts of old memories pressing against his skin. He had spent nights here in quiet solitude, had sat on this very floor watching over the she-wolf he had nursed back to health, had held her newborns in the palm of his hand, helpless and small. And now they were gone. That night, the wind carried whispers through the trees, low and restless, Keanu stood on the porch, his breath curling into the cold air, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets as he stared out into the darkness. It was strange being here again, knowing that somewhere beyond the tree line, life had gone on without him. Selena would have led them deeper into the wilderness, would have taught them how to run, how to hunt, how to survive. He hoped they had survived. A rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. His muscles tensed instinctively, his eyes flicking toward the shadows between the trees. It was nothing at first, just movement, a shift in the wind, the bending of branches beneath unseen weight. But then he saw them. Eyes. A dozen golden glows flickering in the darkness, watching, waiting. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, a memory conjured by the cold and the quiet. But then, the shadows moved, stepping into the pale light of the cabin's glow, and reality slammed into him with the force of a heartbeat. Selena. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her silver gray fur illuminated by the firelight, her body sleek and powerful, no longer the injured, starving creature he had once carried through the snow. She was strong now, commanding, her stance poised with the quiet confidence of a leader. And she was not alone. The wolves flanked her, their bodies moving in silent unity, their eyes locked onto him with cautious curiosity. And there, beside her, standing just a step ahead of the others, Lila. Keanu's chest tightened. She was fully grown now, no longer the tiny, breathless thing he had fought to save. She was strong, her coat thick, her frame lean and fast, her golden eyes sharper than he remembered. And yet, something in her posture was achingly familiar. The slight tilt of her head, the way she took a tentative step forward before stopping, as if caught between instinct and memory. They had come back. Keanu swallowed hard, his throat dry. They asked for nothing. They did not beg, did not seek food or shelter. They simply stood there, silent in the night, watching him as he watched them. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, Selena lowered her head slightly, a slow, deliberate motion, something ancient and knowing. A gesture not of submission, but of recognition. Of something deeper. A bond. Keanu exhaled, the tension in his shoulders melting into something he couldn't quite name. He didn't call out to them, didn't move closer. He didn't need to. They knew. And so did he. A gust of wind swept through the trees, and just like that, they turned. One by one, the wolves melted back into the shadows, their movements fluid, effortless. Lila was the last to leave, lingering for just a moment longer before following her mother into the depths of the forest. Keanu remained on the porch long after they had disappeared, his fingers curled loosely around the railing, his heart still pounding in his chest. They were wild. They were free. And yet, they had come back. Because some bonds, no matter how much time passes, never truly fade.